It all started with one little string of tiny white Christmas lights. In the past, Mr. Merriweather had been happy celebrating Christmas with his wife and their children, Matthew and Sarah. Each year, he made a big show of getting the box of ornaments down from the attic. Then the Merriweather family decorated the tree together and hung a wreath on the front door. But this Christmas was different. We're really going to celebrate Christmas, he announced. This year, we're going to put lights on the house. They were all very excited. Mrs. Merriweather clapped her hands and Sarah hopped on one foot. Then Mr. Merriweather hauled his ladder outside and tacked up a small string of white lights around the front window. "That's fine," he said, admiring his handiwork. He left the lights on all night so he could see the glow from his bedroom. He went to bed a happy man. "Kind of a strimpy little string of lights you got there, pal." Mr. Merriweather stopped shoveling and turned to see Mr. Clack, his neighbor, from across the street. "Wait till you see my house," Mr. Clack bragged. "I've got 17 strings of lights, and they blink on and off." Mr. Merriweather was suddenly embarrassed. "Well, I'm not done yet. You wait till I'm finished, then I guess you'll see something." He pulled his hat down over his ears and went back to his shoveling. That afternoon, Mr. Merriweather gathered up his kids and drove the station wagon to 5 big department stores. He bought so many Christmas decorations that he couldn't close the tailgate. He could hardly wait to get home and put them all up. "Can we really afford all this?" Mrs. Merriweather asked when she saw the decorations. "Of course we can, honey," Mr. Merriweather said. "It's Christmas." That night he peeked out his bedroom window and saw Mr. Clack staring up at all the new displays. He chuckled to himself when Mr. Clack kicked some snow and stomped home. The next day, all of Mr. Merriweather's neighbors stopped by to tell him how wonderful his house looked. He had never gotten so many compliments. They made him feel giddy and full inside, like he'd just eaten a big dinner. But still, he thought, there was room for improvement. Every morning for the next week, Mr. Merriweather fired up the old station wagon and went in search for more decorations, which he carefully added onto his house with the seriousness of a true artist. And every morning the neighbors and their kids came out to see the new wonders sprouting from the house of lights. "Magnificent!" the neighbors exclaimed. "Awesome!" Matthew's and Sarah's friends told them they were lucky to have such a great dad. "Yeah," Matthew said, a little puzzled. "He's really something." Mrs. Merriweather was trying to understand, but she wasn't a little worried. Christmas Day would be here soon, and all it seemed that her husband cared about were the colored lights and the plastic candles. She was relieved when Mr. Merriweather told her he had been to every store he could find and there was nothing left to buy. Then she heard the hammer banging and saw the buzzing from the garage. Several days later, Mr. Merriweather unveiled what he had made. "It is truly an extravaganza," the neighbors gasped. Mr. Merriweather flipped the switch, and a recording of the 12 Days of Christmas blared out of the loudspeakers. Life-sized wooden cutouts filled the yard, representing each of the 12 days. There was maids a-milking, geese a-laying, lords a-leaping, and even a partridge in a pear tree. "And this is nothing," shouted Mr. Merriweather. "You should see what I'm building next." "Terrific," muttered Mr. Clack. "I'm celebrating Christmas as much as the next guy, but this is ridiculous." Mr. Merriweather was no longer thinking about Christmas, however. He was thinking bigger, brighter, and more. The next night, Mr. Merriweather was back to work on his extravaganza. "You better come down now, dear," Mrs. Merriweather called up to him. "The children are in the Christmas program tonight." "Sorry, no time," Mr. Merriweather mumbled through a mouthful of nails. "I've got too much to do. You go on without me." It was hopeless. Mrs. Merriweather tried to explain to Matthew and Sarah that their father was a very busy man. "I think he's got a little wacko," Matthew said. "Hush," scolded his mother. "Don't talk about your father that way." Mr. Merriweather's display continued to grow. One day he put up a Santa's workshop complete with elves. The next day he added a giant snowman made of styrofoam. And finally he built a 50-foot Santa with a mechanical arm that waved. People from 3 counties away brought their children to see the now famous Mr. Merriweather front yard. But it wasn't so much fun for anyone who lived nearby. The extravaganza used so much electricity that there were hardly any left for the neighbors. Their Christmas trees were dim and dull. Their Christmas cookies came out doughy from the ovens that wouldn't heat. The noise from the sightseers honking and yelling was so loud that the annual Christmas caroling had to be canceled. No one could hear them. People visiting their families got stranded for hours in the tangle of traffic. Sometimes they just gave up and went home. Mr. Merriweather didn't even notice. He sat snugly in his brightly lit home, humming along with the 12 Days of Christmas. Finally, the neighbors decided something had to be done. On Christmas Eve, they held a meeting at Mr. Clack's house. "Let's call the cops," someone shouted. "Let's take 'em to court," screamed another. "Now wait a minute," said Mr. Clack. "We don't want to look like a bunch of Scrooges now, do we?" Just then, all the lights in the neighborhood went out. Up and down the street, everything was black. Everything except the Christmas extravaganza, which glowed brighter than ever. "That's the last straw," roared Mr. Clack. "I don't care what people think. I say we tear it down ourselves, tonight." Everyone yelled in agreement, then armed themselves with tools of destruction and swarmed over Mr. Merriweather's front yard, slashing, bashing, and trashing everything in sight. Mr. Merriweather and his wife woke up in midair. "Oh my, oh no," he wailed. "What is it?" cried the children, running into the room. "I think it's an earthquake," Mr. Merriweather exclaimed. They all dove under the bed, huddled together, listening to the terrible screeching, cracking, and thumping that lasted all night long. Finally, the noises stopped. Mr. Merriweather poked his head out from under his bed. It was morning. Christmas morning. He ran downstairs, opened the front door, and couldn't believe what he saw. The Christmas extravaganza was gone. Yesterday, giant snowflakes, Santa Clauses, reindeers, and lights had decorated his house and yard. Now there was only a huge pile of sputtering rubble. Mr. Clack and the rest of the mob were still standing around. Their heavy breath steamed in the cold morning air. "I guess that'll teach you to muck up our neighborhood," Mr. Clack sneered. Mr. Merriweather felt as if he'd been hit by a log. He could barely talk. But I just was celebrating Christmas," he said. "I didn't know what bothered you. I thought you liked it." The neighbors were silent, no longer caught up in their attack. They looked at each other and began to think about what they had done, and they were ashamed. "I'm sorry," Mr. Clapp said sheepily. He picked up a pair of broken reindeer antlers. "Here," he said, "we'll help you put it all back together again. We'll make it even better." Mr. Merriweather shook his head. "No," he said. "I think some nice little white lights will do just fine." He pulled the tiny string out from the smoking heap, and Mr. Clack and all the neighbors helped him tack it up around the front window. Mrs. Merriweather brought out cups of hot cider, and the whole neighborhood admired Mr. Merriweather's tiny string of white lights, his fine tree, and his beautiful wreath. "You know, Mr. Merriweather," Mr. Clack said, "that really was an amazing Christmas extravaganza." "Thank you," replied Mr. Merriweather, "but these are my masterpieces." He hugged Matthew and then swung Sarah high into the air. Mrs. Merriweather took her husband by the arm. "Don't feel bad, dear," she said. "Everyone should be able to celebrate Christmas in his own way, whether it's with lots of lights or none at all. Yours just got so big there was no room for anyone else." "Well, I've learned my lesson," Mr. Merriweather said with a sigh. "I guess I got carried away." "I think everyone did," Mrs. Merriweather said, "but I'm proud of you. I didn't know you were that artistic." Mr. Merriweather smiled. He gazed at his children, his friends, and his big mound of junk. He noticed several large pieces of wood that were still in good condition. He wondered out loud. How many days until Easter? Now that is the end of the story of Mr. Merriweather and his crazy Christmas.